So this morning we were setting the scene, getting some idea what for us are important features of the utopia that we might have a vision of for the future. And I also asked a question which we never got round to, which is, what can Buddhism do to help us to move towards utopia? So rather than having a general discussion on that, I'm going to give a little talk around that, because I think some of you may not know enough about Buddhism in order to really sort of understand what Buddhism might be able to offer in this regard. But in any case, I think also because I've given some thought to these kinds of issues, some of which was reflected in the book The Buddha on Wall Street, and some of which I've been thinking about subsequently. So I want to share that with you this evening. So my starting point for what Buddhism might be able to do to help us move towards utopia is a historical figure called Dr. Ambedkar. Dr. Ambedkar was a Dalit, a so-called untouchable in India, who rose through education and through his own efforts to become a member of the first cabinet, if you like, of independent India in the 1940s. And he is said to be the person most responsible for the writing of the Constitution of India. A really key figure in Indian history. And he's a very important figure in the context of Buddhism, because one of the issues that concerned him was, how could he help the many millions of Dalits to build for themselves a different future within the caste-dominated India. And he considered various options, different kinds of politics and different religions and so on, and he opted eventually, after researching things, he said the most suitable vehicle for us is Buddhism, because he realized that politics alone is not going to be enough, that you need something that is much deeper and more far-reaching in life than just politics, something that actually works on your own self-knowledge, your attitude towards society, taking responsibility for yourself. And he converted to Buddhism, and immediately after being converted himself to Buddhism, he converted hundreds of thousands of his followers. Unfortunately, he died within 6 weeks of this first mass conversion, but he's a hugely influential figure amongst the Buddhists, the new Buddhists in India now, of which there are some. I think their most recent census suggested 8 or 9 or 11 million. Some people reckon it can be as many as 30 million new Buddhists, converts to Buddhism, amongst the Dalits and other lower castes. And he had a very interesting approach to the Dharma. He reinterpreted in some ways the Buddha's teaching, and he related it to the French revolutionary slogans of liberty, equality and fraternity. Very interesting that he took those slogans and gave them a different meaning. And I'm just going to read an extract from the Buddha on Wall Street, which talks about what he meant by liberty, equality and fraternity. Liberty means that people are free to live the kind of life they consider best, so long as they do not harm or infringe the liberty of others. Equality means that everybody has broadly the same opportunities to make the most of their life. And fraternity means an attitude of respect and even of reverence of each citizen for every other. And this attitude of fraternity equated with democracy itself. For Ambedkar, democracy is not merely a means of choosing a government, but is a state of mind, a fraternal attitude that is ultimately one of metta, or loving kindness, that expresses itself in moral or ethical action. Morality being metta, or loving kindness in action. And he taught that society should be founded on ethical principles which themselves are the expression of respect, reverence, and even of metta, or love, for everyone else. So he's a profound influence on the Buddhists in India, and some of that influence and his thinking has fed back into our particular form of Buddhism in the Triratna Buddhist community. But he's a modern Buddhist thinker, and I think his attitudes that he's outlining there are really important in terms of how we can envisage the utopia in the future and how we might help ourselves to move towards that vision of utopia. So that's one aspect of how Buddhism can help. Another aspect is that Buddhism can offer us a middle way, and a middle way between what I call market fundamentalism, which is like the neoliberal economic and political stance, market fundamentalism on the one hand, and state totalitarianism on the other hand. During the 20th century and into the 21st century, we've had these two opposing models very present and evident in our world, particularly in the since the 1920s onwards. Market fundamentalism, with its emphasis on individualism, and state totalitarianism of the kind that we saw in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and to some extent which is still there in China, which, if you like, is an enforced collectivism, an enforced collective approach. And I said that Buddhism offers us a middle way because it recognises that if we are going to create a utopian vision of the future, we have to work at both the level of the individual and at the level of the collective. We need to do both. And when you look at the Buddha's early teachings, the ones contained in the individual, a lot of emphasis on the individual, but you'll also find teachings that are about how we can live together collectively, how the Sangha, the community of followers of the Buddha, can live together, and advice on how societies can operate and live effectively together. There is a view, I think, that the Buddhism is all about the individual and individual enlightenment, which to some extent is true, but there is a significant minority of his teachings which are directed towards the kind of society, the kind of collectivity we need in order to make progress towards enlightenment and towards a collective vision of utopia. So that's the recognition that we need to work at both at the individual and at the collective level. The third thing I think that Buddhism tells us is, if you adopt the attitude that the end justifies the means, you are going to fail. You are going to fail. I'm thinking particularly I always remember reading a statement, I can't remember the exact quote, from Bertolt Brecht, the communist playwright, where he was pondering the future and envisaging a communist society of the future. And he said, those of you in the future who will have the benefits of a communist society, I hope that you can look back at us who have had to do some pretty terrible things to help bring about your future with forgiveness and with kindness. In other words, it's a variation on the end justifies the means. If the end is a peaceful, more just society, the means of violence is justified. In some ways, you can see an equivalent as well with market fundamentalism, in that some economists, maybe many economists, will argue we need to have inequality, and the drastic inequality that we have in our society at the moment, in order for there to be economic growth and eventually for there to be greater well-being for everybody. So the end justifies the means. What Buddhism says, I think, is very interesting, which is that the means will always condition the end. The means that you adopt will always condition the end. One of the central teachings of the Buddha is to do with what we call conditionality or dependent arising. What it's really saying is how actions of body, speech and mind will help of body, speech and mind will help to formulate the kind of people that we will become in the future. It's kind of like a karma, if you like, karma and conditionality. And if you adopt violent means, those violent means will condition the end. If you adopt perpetually violent means to move towards peace, a peaceful and more just society, it's going to make it all the more difficult to achieve a peaceful and just society. The means that you adopt will condition your state of mind and the state of mind of others that come after you. So Buddhism is saying the means condition the end, and please don't forget that. But so in practical terms, what does it mean for us as individuals? Well, I think number one in my mind, which is very, very relevant in our current society in the West, is a teaching of the Buddha, which is basically avoid fixed views. Avoid saying to people, this is the truth, nothing else can possibly be true, I am right, you are wrong. It's very interesting, the Buddha has these teachings to do with wrong views, and one of the key wrong views you can have is to adopt a fixed view, to lose a degree of openness to other people's views and to listen to others. Because if you adopt fixed views, you close your mind. If you close your mind, you limit your own potential to change and develop for the better. So avoiding fixed views, this is very relevant, isn't it? I mean, our society, our political society in particular, is riven with so many people with fixed views and a refusal to listen carefully to the other point of view. So however hard that might be, however much you might feel instinctively that you profoundly disagree with others, you need to listen carefully to what they are saying and understand why they are saying it. If you have a fixed view, you close them off. I think that's a very important point. The second point is, I think it means that we have to work to transform ourselves. This goes back to the working at both individual and collective level. But we have to work to transform ourselves through a whole life practice. So it's not enough if we take up meditation. We have to practice meditation, we have to live ethically. We have to examine carefully our day-to-day ethical actions, and we have to try to reflect and study and gain wisdom. So it's a whole life practice of ethics, meditation and wisdom to work on ourselves. We need also, as well as working on ourselves, and I think I say this a lot to Buddhists, because one of the dangers in modern Buddhism, and especially in the West, is that we close ourselves off to the suffering of others, is that we do need to think how we can practically and effectively relate to the suffering of others. And we'll come back to that later in the retreat, about how each of us might find a way that suits us to engage with helping others to end suffering. And of course, our values must be exemplified in our behaviour. I was reading recently, listening to a talk by one of our order members, and he was talking about, it's very interesting that some people who go on a lot about mindfulness and the importance of mindfulness can't actually turn up on time for the start of a meeting. And, in other words, at a certain very practical level, they're not mindful, and they don't see the paradox in what they're saying. So, but that's a simple thing. But there are obviously other ways that we need to exemplify our values. I don't think Buddhists are evangelical in the sense that, we really push Buddhism at other people. But I think one of the most important ways that we can encourage people to get an interest in Buddhism is through exemplifying its values in our behaviour. It does mean, I think, that if we pursue this looking at our own behaviour and our own attitudes, it can lead to some interesting areas for us. So one of the most common areas is, say, in relation to what we eat. Does it push us in the direction of being vegetarian or vegan? And if we actually are serious about loving kindness towards all living beings, is that one of the consequences of it? Can we become more vegetarian and more vegan? Can we become completely vegetarian or vegan? I struggle with being collectively vegan, but I'm aware that I need to make an effort in that direction. That I feel an inconsistency in the value, so I try to be as vegan as I can. Collectively, there are things that we can do that will help to show a way towards a utopian vision of the future. So Buddhism emphasizes dana, generosity. And we have what we call the dana economy, where we practice generosity in the very simple view of from each according to their ability to do things or to pay, to each according to their need. And we can practice this in terms of what can we each contribute through our own personal generosity. And we can have a whole little economy based around dana or generosity. It's an idea that's gaining traction in many parts of the world. I think in the United States they have these practices. Is it pay it forward? I think it's called. I read a lovely story by a man that I read regularly, who's a neurologist and a philosopher. And he was driving to work and came to a road toll on the way to work. And came up to it, was ready to throw his money in to go through the road toll. And the guy said to him, "No need, the person in front of you paid for you." And he was really bemused by this. And he drove off, and he didn't know the people in front. no idea who they were. And then it hit him that they'd been a random act of kindness that they paid for him to go through. And he said he drove it to work that morning and arrived with a great beaming smile on his face, that this random act of kindness, of dana, changed his day. And you have even like coffee bars and little restaurants now where you don't pay for your own meal. You contribute something towards the next person's meal. And it's an interesting idea that there's no fixed prices. You just give and look at it in terms of contributing for the next person. We can practice friendship and community. The Buddha talks a lot about Sangha, about community. We can practice friendship and community. That's critical, I think. Community, I think, is one of the issues I'd like us to look more at on the retreat. And lastly, I mean, these are not the totality of things that we could do, but lastly, I think this is important, we can provide a space for calm and reflection. Wouldn't it be great if in the House of Parliament that there was times of the day when they all went off into a quiet space for calm and reflection? But we can provide spaces for calm and reflection. We shouldn't underestimate the value of places where people can go just to be calm and just to reflect, like retreat centres, urban Buddhist centres, and so on, providing a space for calm and reflection. So that's some ideas of what we can possibly contribute towards a vision of utopia and how we might get to utopia. I think in a way, what I want to finish with is a lot of this is summarised in a beautiful teaching by the Buddha that's called the Karaniya Metta Sutta, the teaching on loving kindness. And I'm going to read a translation of this sutta. I'm going to read it out, this teaching by the Buddha. I'm paraphrasing it slightly, so it's less technical in some ways, but I'm going to paraphrase it just a little. But this is the Buddha's teaching on loving kindness. This is what should be done by one who is skilled in the good. Having made the breakthrough to that peaceful state, having made the breakthrough to enlightenment, they should be able, upright, very upright, amenable to advice, and gentle without any arrogance. They should be content and easily supported. In other words, needing little in the way of everyday possessions, little in the way of food and so on. Of few duties and a frugal way of living, keeping your life very simple. Of peaceful faculties and judicious, courteous, without greed when among families. That's an odd phrase, isn't it? Without greed when among families. What that's referring to is the Buddha and his monks would go out with an alms bowl, stand outside houses, waiting to see if someone would come out and give them some food. But there was always a temptation for the monks and nuns to form a particular relationship with particular houses or families and expect particular kinds of foods or gifts. So it's a big temptation. So the Buddha used to say, you know, you were never allowed to indicate to anybody what kind of food you like. So you couldn't be standing outside there and somebody comes along and gives you curry. Oh, I don't like curry so much. Not today, thank you. You've got something else. You can't do that. You have to take what is given to you. So without greed when among families, I think is referring to that. They should not do anything, however slight, because of which other wise people might criticize them. So it's saying you need to act in a way that those who are wiser and more spiritually progressed than you would not find anything to criticize you for. And then the teaching shifts. May all beings be happy and secure. May they be inwardly happy. In other words, may they have an inner contentment and fulfillment. And it goes on. This is the attitude you should have. Whatever living beings there are, whether frail or firm, without omission, those that are long or those that are large, middling, short, fine or gross. They're describing lots of different kinds of beings, whether they are seen or unseen, whether they dwell far away or nearby, whether they have come to be or will come to be. In other words, that's say whether they have already existed or exist now or will come to be, is saying you must direct your positive attitude towards those living beings that will come in the future. All of these, you should say, may all beings be inwardly happy. So you are directing the wish for kindness and happiness towards all living beings, whether near or far, whether you know them in our local community or in your nation state or far beyond that, whatever sizes they are, whether it's tiny insects or big animals or whatever, whether they're living now or will be born in the future, which is directing us to have a mind to what will happen to future generations of living beings. You have the wish for all to be inwardly happy. No one should deceive another, nor despise anyone anywhere. Because of anger and thoughts of aversion, no one should wish suffering for another. Don't engage in wishing bad things, hatred for others. Just as a mother would protect her child, her only child, with her own life, so one should develop towards all beings a state of mind without boundaries. It's basically saying the attitude of loving kindness that a mother has for their only child should be the attitude, the boundless attitude that you try to cultivate for all beings. And toward the whole world one should develop loving kindness below and across, unconfined, without enmity, without adversaries. Whether standing, walking, sitting or lying down, as long as one is not drowsy, one should resolve on this mindfulness, the mindfulness of being kind towards everybody. They call this a divine dwelling here. Not taking up any views, a reminder of what I was saying about not getting stuck in fixed views. Possessing good behaviour, endowed with vision, with wisdom, having removed greed for sensual pleasures, no longer being dependent upon sensual pleasures, one never again is reborn. So it's quite a lovely teaching, and I think a lot of the Buddhist approach to moving towards a utopia, a vision of utopia, is contained in that one teaching. And maybe I'll finish there. Okay?